Everyone loves a good mystery, whether it's a ship floating aimlessly in the ocean without a single crew member on board, or a lighthouse found undisturbed but completely abandoned. Mysteries feed our fear of the unknown and our desire to find answers, and when there is no answer to be found, it can lead to conspiracy. And that's what I'm here to talk about today, some of the strangest mysteries from our history on this strange rock and the theories that have cropped up to explain them. Also, a bit of a warning for this video: if you are someone who doesn't do well with descriptions of death or dead bodies, you might want to sit this one out. I love telling stories, but the last thing I want to do is ruin a good time by triggering someone's anxiety. So if that's you, thank you for the support. There's other stories on this channel and more on the way that won't include those things, so I'll see you in a different video. If you're still here, I'll get on with it, and thank you for watching. I'm going to start off with perhaps the most famous ship with no crew, the Mary Celeste. On December 4th, 1872, just off the coast of the Azores Islands west of Portugal, Captain David Morehouse and his crew of the merchant ship De Gratia were making their way to Genoa in the Mediterranean when they saw a ship sailing in the distance acting strangely. As they approached and signaled the ship, they received no reply and noticed that the sails were in poor condition. One of them was even missing. After boarding the ship, the crew discovered that aside from a few feet of water in the cargo hold and a missing lifeboat, nothing on board the ship seemed out of order. It was as if the crew just vanished, taking the ship's papers and navigation equipment with them. Upon inspecting the ship's log, the last entry was 9 days prior and positioned the ship 400 miles to the west. The ship was eventually towed to Gibraltar, where a hearing about the salvage prize would take place. Back then, if you recovered a lost or abandoned ship, you could be paid a portion of the cost for the cargo on board. And theories about what happened to the crew started immediately, with one member of the hearing claiming that the crew murdered the captain and the officers before fleeing the ship. This was spurred on by the fact that a suspicious substance assumed to be blood was found on the captain's sword and several other areas of the ship. However, these theories were debunked thanks to testing that proved the substance was in fact not blood. There was also some suspicion that the owner of the ship had the crew abandon her on purpose in order to claim her for insurance money, but again, nothing could be conclusively proven. Ultimately, Captain Morehouse and his crew were paid a fraction of the expected price, in part due to one of the investigators who was convinced that Morehouse and his crew murdered the original captain and doctored the ship's log. But what do I think? Aliens. No, honestly, I have no concrete idea what would make a well-seasoned captain and crew abandon a fully seaworthy and stocked ship, except maybe one. A waterspout is a weather phenomenon that occurs when mixed air pressures lead to a giant column of water being lifted into the air. If this occurred and then the water came crashing onto the ship, it could explain the water in the hold and the state of the sails. This, paired with the fact that a sounding rod, an instrument used to measure water depth, was found on the deck, may mean that the captain believed the ship was taking on more water than it was and decided to leave before it sank. Granted, I also like the theory that the alcohol in the hold was vaporizing and caused the crew to hallucinate and throw themselves from the ship, but there's almost no grounding for that. Ultimately, it remains a very strange case and one of my favorite maritime mysteries. Now, if you thought that abandoned ships were something that only happened back in the 1800s, you've got another thing coming, because this story took place in 1955. The Joyita was an American merchant vessel deployed in the South Pacific and was scheduled to take off from Samoa on October 2nd with a cargo of medical supplies, timber, and empty oil drums. However, the departure was delayed due to a faulty clutch in one of the engines, a problem that was never fixed before they left the following day. The boat was headed to an island just 270 miles north, a journey that was expected to take roughly 48 hours, arriving on October 5th. However, on October 6th, the message went out that the ship was overdue. A 6-day search and rescue operation ensued, covering nearly 100,000 square miles of ocean and turning up nothing. No debris, no life raft, no cargo, nothing. The search was eventually called off, and that was the end of it, until on November 5th. 5 weeks after the ship went missing, the Joyita was found. However, she was in pretty rough condition. The ship was found partially submerged and tilting or listing heavily to the left, and there was no sign of her 25 passengers and crew. The superstructure, or the large portion of the ship above the deck, was heavily damaged and had a large piece of canvas awning covering the bridge. In addition, over 4 tons of cargo was missing, along with all the life rafts and a dinghy that the ship carried. Its logbook, navigation equipment, and firearms that the captain carried were all missing. The radio on board was found tuned to the International Distress Channel, and all the switches for the onboard lighting were switched to the on position. However, upon further inspection, it was discovered that the wiring from the radio to the antenna was broken and had been painted over to hide the issue, meaning the radio had a measly range of just 2 miles. This was all bad, but what was worse was the fact that bloody bandages were found on board and the ship was found over 600 miles west of its original route. So what happened to cause so many problems? Well, the easily explainable things are the faulty wiring, explaining why no distress signal was ever heard, as well as why they were unable to pump out the water that had filled the ship. But how could it still be somewhat afloat with so much water inside? Well, that came down to the fact that it was a partially cork construction, which actually made the fact that the crew was gone even stranger. The biggest theories about what happened included that they were attacked by Japanese fishermen in the area. It was 1955, and tensions still existed between US and Japanese vessels. There was also a theory that the crew had mutinied against the captain for his insistence on leaving on one engine, but they were unable to rescue the ship. Or that the captain had been injured and unable to lead, and the inexperienced remaining members decided to abandon the ship. And just like the Mary Celeste, there were theories of insurance fraud, but to this day, there's been no conclusive answers as to what happened. And I personally think that it was just a number of cascading factors, mostly related to the poor maintenance of the ship. Having a radio that has a broken connection, bilge pumps with no strainers so they become clogged, and only one engine. All of that is horrible, and no matter how skilled a captain, sometimes good leadership just can't beat bad maintenance. And it's also just a great example of not taking unprepared equipment into the freaking ocean. Anyway, let's bring it back to land with the 1928 disappearance of a 9-year-old boy, Walter Collins. On March 10, 1928, Walter left his home in Los Angeles, California to go to the movie theater and never returned. He was reported missing with the Los Angeles Police Department by his mother, Christine, and it was quickly receiving national attention, with the LAPD following up on hundreds of leads with no success. This pattern of receiving and following a lead to nowhere continued for 5 long months, with pressure continually mounting on the LAPD to find the child. Then, in August of 1928, a young boy claiming to be Walter was found in DeKalb, Illinois, and was promptly returned to his mother, Christine. Case closed. Or at least it could have been, except for the fact that this boy wasn't Walter, and Christine knew it. She told the officer in charge of the case that the boy wasn't her son, at which point he apologized and continued the search. Nah, just kidding. He had her placed in a mental institution under what was at the time called a Code 12, which meant, quote, a term used to commit someone who is deemed difficult or an inconvenience. Because the 1920s, I guess. She was eventually released, and the child who had claimed to be her son said that he did it so he could go to Hollywood and try to meet his favorite actor, which we all know how that tends to go. After her release, she would continue to search for her son, and in 1929 there was a chance for closure, but it wasn't a good one. Gordon Stewart Northcott was found guilty of abducting, Epsteining, and killing 3 young boys in Southern California, and his mother admitted to helping him with the murders, and she claimed that Walter Collins was one of them. A statement she rescinded after being sent straight to jail and was never proven to be conclusive due to conflicting statements from Gordon and his mother, and the fact that the remains of all 3 boys were found. But Christine continued to search for Walter for the rest of her life, but was never able to find him. She died a few days before her 76th birthday. Also, she sued the officer that was in charge of her case for having her committed, a suit that she won, and then he just refused to pay her. And this is genuinely one of the saddest stories I've ever read. Just a mother trying her best to find her son, who she trusted was safe to go to the movies, and then the officer she trusted to find her son throws her into a nut house to protect his image and that of the department. It's just really crappy. And speaking of crappy investigations, we have the 1946 disappearance of Paula Jean Weldon. A student at Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont, Paula left her college dorm room on the afternoon of December 1st to go for a hike on the Long Trail, a hiking trail that runs the entire length of the state. She was dressed for the weather, but took with her no extra clothes and no money, leading investigators to believe that she was not expecting to be gone long. After passing several other hikers on the trail and a man who lived just off the trail, she disappeared and was never found. And unfortunately, there really isn't much in terms of leads or any other information on her disappearance, as the local law enforcement that took care of the investigation, well, they were not prepared for this. In fact, the entire state of Vermont was not prepared for this because they didn't even have a state agency that could take the case from the local sheriff and handle the bulk of the investigation. And while those in charge of the investigation never made any conclusion and never found her alive or dead, her disappearance and the subsequent investigation did lead to the founding of the Vermont State Police, which hopefully has done good work since. I don't really know too much about Vermont. Alright, let's get away from the disappearance of innocent children and move on to the disappearances of genuinely crappy adults. James Riddle Hoffa, better known as Jimmy, was a union leader in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, most notably as the president of the Teamsters, the largest union in the United States, from 1957 to 1971. From the early years of his involvement with the union, he made many connections to organized crime and the Mafia, like all unions do. This meant that he was not only involved in union organizing, which involves some shady practices on its own, but also in criminal activities as well. Over the course of his years with the Teamsters, he would be convicted of several crimes, including jury tampering, attempted bribery, conspiracy, and mail and wire fraud, and was actually sent to prison in 1967 on a 13-year sentence. However, he worked out a deal with then-President Richard Nixon where he would be released from prison on the terms that he would resign as the Teamsters president and would not engage in union activity until 1980, which he agreed to. However, he spent quite a few years trying to get the agreement changed so he could get back into union work, but it was unsuccessful. And it was during this time that Hoffa had several relationships within the Mafia start to break down. Now, just like any Mafia story, it's very complicated, with lots of history, intertwining relationships, and four-syllable names. But basically, Hoffa was set to meet with a former friend turned enemy, Anthony Provenzano, who already had two of his enemies killed and at one point threatened to pull out Hoffa's guts. Basic Italian stuff. The goal of the meeting was to try and smooth over their relationship and work on getting Hoffa back into union work. They were supposed to meet at a restaurant at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, July 30th, 1975. But by 2:30, nobody had shown up and Hoffa was frustrated, so he called his wife and said he'd be home by 4. He wasn't, if you haven't figured out where this is going. His wife reported him missing the next day, and what followed was a decades-long FBI investigation that ultimately turned up nothing. And not a single person has ever been convicted in connection to his disappearance, which we might as well call a murder. He was murdered. There are a ton of theories as to where he's buried, and there are some people who still do their own searches and digs in the Detroit area looking for his body to this day. But the most common theory among experts is that his body was cremated. This is another one of those stories that I want to make a deep dive video on for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think the mob relationships are fascinating. All the politics, money, and power that is involved and how much pride is involved in how they operate is just fascinating to me. Number two, it's just a fantastic true crime mystery. And number three is because of one of my best friends. My friend's mom is, let's say, a strong-willed woman who has connections to the mob, which I did not know at the time, and when I first met her, I jokingly asked her, "Where's Jimmy Hoffa?" To which she responded while staring into my soul, "Wouldn't you like to know?" And it is still probably one of my favorite first impressions of anyone I've ever met, so I have to make a video about it. This one's just weird and really sad. Robert Bud Dwyer was the treasurer of Pennsylvania from 1981 to 1987 and had spent quite a few years serving in Pennsylvania politics as both a state representative and a state senator. In the 1980s, the state of Pennsylvania discovered that state employees had been overpaying their federal taxes due to withholding errors in the state system. After Dwyer was elected to be treasurer, this was one of the major projects that fell into his lap. There were multiple millions of dollars that had to be discovered and repaid to state workers, and the contract for resolving these issues was a hot-button topic. Unfortunately, Dwyer fell for the good old government corruption and sought to award the $6 million contract to a firm out of California that was less experienced and more expensive than the competitors. This was discovered, however, and he was eventually charged on 11 counts of fraud, conspiracy, perjury, and racketeering, and was set to be sentenced on January 23, 1987. Up until then, Dwyer did everything he could to try and get the charges dropped, and even asked for a presidential pardon from Ronald Reagan, which he couldn't get since he hadn't been sentenced yet. None of his efforts worked, however, and he was going to have to face his sentence. So Dwyer decided that he was going to face the charges and sentencing with dignity. But before that, he decided that he should hold a press conference and confront the people of Pennsylvania first. So a press conference was held on January 22, 1975 at his offices in the Pennsylvania Finance Building, where he prepared a 21-page statement that was supposed to end with his resignation as treasurer. Throughout the statement, Dwyer maintained that he was innocent of the charges placed against him and that he was a victim of targeting from the Justice Department. His speech lasted over 30 minutes, so long that some of the news crews started packing up their cameras, at which point he turned to them and said, "I think you ought to stay because we're not finished yet." He continued his remarks, asking if those who still believed in his innocence would continue to try and create a system of true justice in the United States and to not let his sacrifice be in vain. He then said "I love you" to his wife and kids, calmly passed out letters to his staffers, and then pulled a .357 Magnum revolver from a manila envelope, placed the barrel in his mouth, and fired. He slumped to the ground and was pronounced dead from a single gunshot wound to the head at 11:31 a.m., and footage for the news cameras was broadcast, some in its entirety, some with a still image of Dwyer holding the handgun with the audio playing in the background, and some cut only the fatal moment of the shot. There are several theories as to why Dwyer did what he did. Some state that it was just a political statement against the justice system and those involved with his case. Others stating that he did it in order to ensure that his pension would be paid out to his wife, something that wouldn't happen if he was removed from office after his sentencing, and he didn't want to leave his family in the financial ruin they were in due to the legal fees that had mounted from this case. And honestly, for me, it's not even about why exactly he did it, but that he did it in the first place. If it's true that he was guilty of what he was accused of, then I think he should have taken his sentencing and allowed justice to play its course, because you can't say that you're a proponent of justice and then not accept judgment when it falls on you. And if he was innocent, then I think he needed to continue to fight to prove that, because all his death did was leave his children without a father, his wife without a husband, and anyone in the room or in front of the TV scarred from what they witnessed. And I also hate that he was just a hypocrite. Before pulling the trigger, he told anyone who might be affected by watching him do this to please leave the room, which on the surface is very considerate of him, but just minutes earlier, he had told the camera crews to stay. And I'm just sad that anyone who believed that there was a problem within the system removed themselves from ever being able to fight to correct it and harmed other people in the process. I realized as I was editing this portion that I forgot to mention something important. Dwyer had originally planned his press conference to be during a time when kids would be at school so that they wouldn't have to see this, except all over Pennsylvania and the rest of the country, it was a snow day, so there was hundreds, if not thousands of kids that were home from school, potentially sitting watching the TV with their parents that got traumatized by watching this happen live on television. So even when he's supposedly trying to be considerate to that, it still didn't work. This video is making me much more sad than the last one. Oh, why do I do this to myself? Okay, there's a bridge outside of a town in Scotland that has the reputation of dogs jumping to their death. And I know what you're thinking. How many dogs have to do this to get that reputation? How about 300 since the 1950s, with over 50 dogs dying and most of them receiving serious injuries? That's 4 dogs a year that have looked at this bridge and decided, yep, this is where it ends. And of course there has to be an explanation for this one, right? Sort of. The family that has lived in the house right on the side of the bridge for years believes that the scent of a mink or other woodland creature is causing dogs to do this. And I could believe that for some dogs, because some dogs are frankly just stupid. But the bridge is 50 feet above the rocks below. I would think that any dog would have the self-preservation skills not to make that jump. I don't buy it, okay? My dog that I had growing up was a German Shorthair and the deadliest dog I have ever seen. He killed more birds than the flu, more skunks than an interstate highway, and enough beavers to make the largest top hat in history.
It's funny because it's bigger than a normal hat.
One time I came home to find a dead deer in our backyard, and he couldn't have cared less because he was too busy chasing the stuff he hadn't killed yet. That dog would do anything to hunt. But if I took him to that bridge and a mink was at the bottom, he'd take one look at that jump and say, "Nah, I'm gonna take the long way to kill you." This is one of those times where I'm just gonna have to go with the paranormal explanation and say that that bridge is haunted and dogs just don't want to cross it. And speaking of Scotland, we now have one of my favorite maritime mysteries, the Flannan Isle Lighthouse disappearances. The Flannan Isle Lighthouse is just that. A lighthouse situated on an island just off the northwest coast of Scotland. And just like most island-based lighthouses, it's in a pretty rough place to get to, with the wind and the waves of the sea constantly battering against the island. The isolation and weather make tending to a lighthouse like this a job unlike any other. It's cold, lonely, and ultimately a little bit boring. Being stuck on a rock with nothing to do but tend to a cold white tower of light set against the backdrop of a colder Black Sea presents a challenge I don't think many people understand today. But if we go all the way back to the first year of the 20th century, 1900, in the month of December, we find our story. The lighthouse was being crewed by 3 men, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, with a 4th man serving to rotate in and give the men a break when needed. On December 15th, a steamship sailed past the island and noticed that the light wasn't on. This was a big no-no, as the area is well known for being problematic for ships to navigate through the web of sharp rocks and rough seas. The captain of the ship reported this to the authorities when he arrived in port on December 18th, and a planned investigation was set to leave on the 20th, but had to be postponed due to rough weather. Eventually, the ship that was sent made it to the lighthouse, and what they found was very puzzling. They discovered everything, aside from the light being off and the clocks not being wound, to be in pretty good order. No sign of any disaster or panicked evacuation. In fact, those things were all to be expected since the light hadn't been on for over 11 days at this point, so really the only thing that was truly out of place was MacArthur's raincoat, which was found hanging from the hook inside. This prompted a further investigation on the rest of the grounds, starting with the eastern side of the island where they discovered again, everything seemed fine. However, everything was not fine on the western side of the island. The first thing they discovered were clods of dirt and grass that had been ripped off the ground over 200 feet above sea level, and at 108 feet, they discovered a supply crate smashed to pieces and its contents scattered all over the hillside. But what they found as they approached the boat landing was even more concerning. The path down to the ocean had these iron railings set in concrete within the rocks, and those railings had been ripped from the concrete and folded into a mangled mass of metal. This, paired with the fact that a rock weighing over 2,000 pounds had been jolted from its resting place, led those investigating to believe that a horrifically powerful force had been unleashed on this island. And this is where the theories of what happened start to run wild. Some are quite simple, suggesting that the men had gone out in the storm to secure supplies, only for a massive wave to sweep them out to sea. Others suggest that a massive storm struck the island with such force that the men forgot to tend to the light, allowing it to go out, only for the spirits of dead sailors to come and drag them to the depths for failing to fulfill their duty. And even others suggesting that Poseidon himself smashed the western landing and pulled the men down to his domain himself. These theories were also fueled by a fake logbook entries that had circulated, stating a storm unlike any that the experienced keeper had seen in his 20 years of service was bearing down on them. The log entry continued that the storm was worsened and all 3 men were praying for God to save them from the storm. The final log entry stated simply, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." These log entries gave rise to the idea that God himself had taken the 3 men up to heaven like Elijah, but rather than a chariot of fire, he used water. So what do I think? Honestly, I have no idea what to think of this story. The superstitious sailor in me says that they were taken by some sea monster or maybe Poseidon himself. And the child of Christ in me just thinks this was a freak accident in a terrible storm on a remote part of the world, and the men died like most people in history. tragically. But what do you think of all these stories? Is there a theory that I missed about any of these stories that you think is a more likely version of the truth? Are there any mysteries that I missed in this video or in my first video? I have some more to share, and I'm happy with any suggestions for other mysteries that should be talked about. And if there's any topic I covered that you want to see me go more in depth on, let me know. I already have a few in mind, but I'm open to more suggestions. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. Don't take your dog to any suspicious looking bridges. Don't sail a boat that doesn't have proper maintenance. And for the love of God, don't mess with the mob. But above all, go live a story worth telling, and I'll see you in the next one. The end.